I call Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think I've said it before, and I'll probably end up saying it for the rest of the time I'm here in Parliament, for this term anyway. It's difficult coming in at number 7 to speak on a piece of legislation that you're supporting, where pretty much all of the speakers before you have capped and hit all the main issues that we've dealt with. But I think I won't absorb all of the House's time. I simply wish to say on behalf of New Zealand First, we have appreciated the way in which the Select Committee was able to function through the submissions process on this bill. We recognise that this piece of legislation unfortunately has come to the House on the back of the Christchurch earthquakes, something that those of us outside who lived outside of Christchurch may well be forgiven for not comprehending how serious these issues impacted on the people of Christchurch, but which we do know did result in some deaths that arguably, in hindsight, with the benefit of hindsight, might well have been avoided had we had some different regulations in place at the time, something that more resembled the piece of legislation that we're passing now. We recognise that the bill was introduced in 2013, that what is now before the House is substantially different from that piece of legislation that was proposed, and we're very thankful for that, thankful to all of those people, those organisations and entities that took time to submit and to make known their views to the Select Committee. Thankful to the Select Committee that they looked at this dispassionately across without any political views, perceptions at all, or objectives, and that the government took those recommendations and pretty much has enshrined them into the legislation. I think for myself, having come from local government and having been in local government at the time when this bill was introduced into the House, also as one who had family who lived in Christchurch, who were very much caught up in the earthquakes, a son who was first on the scene and within 10-15 minutes dealt with 3 fatalities, being a police officer. Son-in-law who was a squad leader in a USAR team, Scott Shadbolt, firefighter, who was subsequently awarded the highest Valour Award that the fire service is able to give anyone. In fact, he is only one of 3 firefighters ever to receive that award for his actions in the Christchurch earthquake. And in fact, he was the first recipient for 103 years. With a brother-in-law who was also a team leader in USAR, I guess I was privileged to get a very good first-hand understanding of what occurred that day and the subsequent days and the reasons behind some of those fatalities. So it is, in some sort of, in a funny sort of way, satisfying to be able to stand here in the House and see a piece of legislation go through the House that redresses those issues. I've got to say, I've got to hand it to the USAR teams, Mr. Speaker. Those squads, those teams are made up of a large number of engineers, professional engineers, tradespeople, who are also firefighters, and those who are not necessarily firefighters but who are members of USAR, because it is their desire to serve our people in times of need such as this, and they bring their professional skills to bear. Many of those people were able to see firsthand the impact of unreinforced masonry, of high facades that had no support, and the consequences of them being shaken loose from those parapets and left to fall. And those firefighters and police officers will live with those memories for the rest of their lives. So I hope it will be satisfying to them to know that the House has seriously considered the consequences and has done its very best to move legislation that prevents these things ever happening again. I also want to compliment those who submitted and made it very clear to the Select Committee that the first priority had to be dealing with that issue. And the Select Committee listened and thankfully. Also so did the Minister and the government. There were also submissions that came through from the rural community that resonated very well with New Zealand First, particularly with myself, because at the time that this legislation was introduced into the House, there was a bit of a panic out there, Mr. Speaker, and there were all sorts of views developed as to what the costs were going to be. And in rural provincial New Zealand, people were saying, we simply cannot afford to strengthen these old buildings. We'd be better off driving a bulldozer straight through the centre of them and starting again. And you had to accept that. But one of the problems was that for many rural provincial towns, those very buildings that we were talking about were part of the nature and the character of the town. They were historic. They may not have had a historic rating by Heritage New Zealand, but they certainly were historic and of importance to those small rural communities. And we had some very good presentations from rural communities and local government New Zealand, who pointed out that if you applied zealous building standards in rural provincial New Zealand, it might well be that a building, that facade could fall, but, you know, for golly sakes, the impact of a facade falling at Pongaroa at 2 o'clock in the morning would be somewhat different to the impact of a facade falling at 2 o'clock in the morning in Courtenay Place. The number of people on the street, the traffic, the risk of injury in those outlying rural areas. And when one also considered that many of the buildings in outlying rural New Zealand, and we had this sort of conversation with the racing board as well, about the race courses and the buildings and facilities, the grandstands out in, you know, places like Woodville and other rural provincial towns. The risk posed to those people out there, given the frequency of occupation, the frequency of use, compared to the risk posed to metropolitan New Zealand, were quite different. And the committee had to consider that. And I acknowledge, I think recognition needs to be given to the Minister. The Minister and the Cabinet had to consider that as well. It is pleasing that all of those concerns were factored in. It is pleasing, and I think it speaks well of Parliament and of the Select Committee that those factors were given recognition and some rationale and common sense was brought to bear. The cost to some of the property owners in rural provincial New Zealand, when the legislation was first introduced, the costs that they thought they were going to have to bear were thought to be astronomical. Some of them did go ahead and strengthen to standards, which subsequently might not, we may look back and say, well, a bit of overkill in the light of this legislation. But the focus on cost, risk, and a pragmatic view has, at the end of the day, prevailed, Mr. Speaker. And for that, I think the Select Committee can rightfully be very proud. I'll just conclude by saying New Zealand First does support the passage of this legislation. Very pleased with the way in which it's moved through the Select Committee process, and very pleased with the way in which it's been represented in the House here today. Thank you.